There is a short story about the clown festival by Thomas Ligotti called The Last Feast of Harlequin. The protagonist of the story is an anthropologist who studies clowns. One day, he decides to visit a fictional town called Miraco to learn about the town's obscure annual clown festival. He is very excited to participate in what he thinks will be a jovial and rare celebration, a much-needed celebration for him personally as he suffers from a seasonal depression that usually descends on him around Christmas. However, the festival turned out to be not what he expected. Yes, on the surface level, this city has a cheerful, maybe even way too cheerful clown festival, but it serves as a distraction from something very sinister that is actually going on. The real clowns of Miraco are not what one would expect. They are not dressed in colorful silly clothes, wearing a red nose and a wig. They look more like the creature from Munch's famous painting. They aimlessly roam around with open flabby mouths and empty eyes, creating an atmosphere of despair everywhere they go. They possess a, quote, nauseating passivity. People try to avoid them like leprosy. Like one would want to hush away self-defeating thoughts by distracting themselves with entertainment, citizens of Miraco created the festival specifically to conceal the presence of these clowns. And our protagonist wants to know more about these melancholic creatures. This is why on the last day of the festival he sneaks in with the group of clowns by disguising as one of them. Surprisingly, he finds the camouflage quite fitting. Quote, "I remember how I was momentarily overtaken by a feeling I had never known, when in disguise I drifted through the streets of Miraco, untouched by the drunken, noisy forms around me. Untouchable. It was the feeling that I had been liberated from the weight of life." Following these lethargic creatures, he enters an underground tunnel, Alice in Wonderland style. The tunnel leads to a spot for some kind of ritual, during which the bodies of clowns morph into the inhumane, worm-like creature, ultimately experiencing an ego death. Unable to endure the sight of this repulsive ritual, our protagonist escapes in horror, only to realize later that he belongs to these clowns. He has always been one of them. He is destined to eventually come back. Thomas Ligotti, the author of this short story, is not only a horror writer, but also a pessimist thinker. I believe that The Last Feast of Harlequin presents the gist of Ligotti's thought quite succinctly. All main themes that haunt Ligotti's oeuvre are here: depression, fatalism, puppet-like lack of agency, ego death, and the inevitability of slipping into a nightmare that is, in fact, a reality. As is usually the case in horror, within the milieu of pessimist thought too, knowledge is rarely a blessing. The more you learn, the deeper you dig, the closer you are to the nightmare. Beneath the banality and routine of our day-to-day life lurks something abysmal and sinister. The idea that the world is a horrible and unfair place is no news. Ask anyone, really. Naive optimism was never a big thing in philosophical thought. This is why, throughout ages, much of it was devoted to finding ways to fix stuff, or, if that is not an option, to at least fix our attitude towards something that cannot be fixed. As the old saying goes, it is what it is. And even if there is too much suffering, through suffering, one can reach happiness in this life, in the afterlife, for future generations, and so on. Suffering has its teleology. Pain has its purpose. And even if there is no purpose, we have to imagine Sisyphus happy, right? But to some thinkers, no amount of joy, happiness, pleasure, greatness, and other rewards in this life or afterlife or for future generations is enough to justify the existence of suffering, or even the simple fact that we are all aware of death. For these types, as Ligotti puts it, being alive is not alright. Some things just cannot be fixed. This doomer mentality usually goes under the name of pessimism, and let's put it this way, philosophical pessimism has a bad reputation. It kills the vibe, it sells poorly, it is perceived as unproductive and annoying at best, and life-threatening at worst. Think about the reaction of Marty Hart to Rust Coe's pessimistic rant in the car in the first season of True Detective.
That sounds god-fucking awful, Rust.
Or a less-known TV show, The Sinner, where in the third season, The main character, Jamie, actively befriends a group of people at the bar only to later kill the vibe by stunning them with this monologue.
We're scared. There's this big yawning void we're stuck in the middle of, and we're all just grabbing on to anything we can, right? Don't look down.
Unlike Rust Cole from True Detective, who at least has personal reasons to have a pessimistic outlook on life, he tragically lost his daughter and works as a detective witnessing man-made horrors beyond your comprehension. Jamie is quite well off financially and in his personal life, yet he is overtaken by dismal, which eventually leads him to destructiveness. And I think that generally speaking, this is exactly how a lot of people perceive pessimists out in the wild. Eugene Thacker, in the third volume of Horror of Philosophy, points out that, at least in the American culture, there is this antagonism between pessimism and the individualist culture of resolving your own problems, and in this light, pessimists are considered as a part of the problem and just crybabies, people who have too much time to think about all this dark stuff, spiteful hypocrites who don't see any value in life but have no guts to end it and spare everyone from their infectious dark outbursts. Infectious. I remember questioning myself whether I really wanted to engage with Ligotti's work, as if his ideas are infectious. You just don't want to slide into this morbid way of thinking. Yes, we all have some pessimistic thoughts, but they are on the periphery. We shush them away like annoying insects. But like horror, pessimism creeps in, and once the door is open, there is no turning back. Will you go there with me? Down the rabbit hole. So, philosophical pessimism is a worldview that points to the prevalence of suffering in life and the futility of doing anything about it. It covers a range of views from pessimistic determinism to antinatalism. Pessimism takes on different forms, from heroic resistance to the horrors of life to more vulgar forms such as the idea of the futility of self-improvement, also known as black pill, that originated in the incel community. Mark Fisher in Ghosts of My Life described depression as a neurophilosophical disposition rather than a state of mind, when all sheltering values and illusions were being lost to uncover the final truth. In the same vein, pessimism is a certain theory about life. Thomas Ligotti characterizes a pessimistic outlook on life as a, quote, morbid mind. Part 1. The Prevalence of Suffering. A major concern for philosophical pessimism is the impossibility of long-term fulfillment in life. Harlequin comes in pair with Pierrot, joy comes with sorrow, and pleasure comes with pain. To know one, you have to know the other, but we still tend to think that there is a somewhat balance between good and bad experiences. To contrast this belief, a German pessimist philosopher, Arthur Schopenhauer, at the end of his The World as Will and Representation, showed a very grim picture of reality. He wrote about how happiness, pleasure, and joy have a negative characteristic rather than a positive one. Influenced heavily by Buddhist thought, Schopenhauer points out how desire always preludes pleasure. Thus, satisfaction can be only achieved on the condition that there is some form of deficiency. Plus, satisfaction is always short. So, deficiency, lack, desire, loss, and struggle are what push the engines of the will, not joy, happiness, and pleasure. This paradox of desire is also evident in the works of tragic or epic art, which can only depict a struggle, a striving, a battle for happiness, but never happiness itself, permanent and final. It leads a hero to the goal throughout thousands of difficulties and dangers, but as soon as the goal is achieved, the fulfillment quickly is interrupted by another loss, some new struggle. The prevalence of suffering is something that antinatalists like South African philosopher David Benatar count on. Since there is a risk of a terrible life for any newborn, and even if this life won't be overall terrible, the negative experience would prevail nevertheless. It is ethically preferable for humans to just stop reproducing. This negative evaluation of life should not be equated with the desire to die, since, as David Benatar writes, quote, "Life is bad, but so is death." A lot of times when pessimists point to how life is terrible and we're powerless, the reaction to it is, well, you're a hypocrite if you are still here with us. In The Confession, Lev Tolstoy, who was tortured by his pessimism at the peak of his career, spoke about different ways of dragging oneself out of pessimism, and he called suicide the way of strength. Being haunted by the question of whether life has a meaning that is not destroyed by the inevitability of death, Tolstoy considered himself not strong enough to end his own life, though at some point he stopped carrying a gun while hunting as it was too tempting to use it on himself. Tolstoy eventually was saved by faith, and not institutional faith, by the way, but a folk, simple faith that affirms life. But his reflection on pessimism shows that no amount of success and greatness would shelter a person from contemplating ways out of this life. And unfortunately, there is no shortage of pessimist thinkers who made their decision in favor of ending their lives. At the same time, some pessimists actually argue against the suicide. Schopenhauer, in The World as Will and Representation, described will as a blind force that pushes everything and everyone, not just human beings, through life. Since the will to live also covers the existence of all that is alive, nothing stops with the death of an individual. So death is not a solution, but a part of the tragedy of our existence that will eventually ensue on us all. So what's the point of rushing things? This also brings us to the form of what can be called heroic pessimism, which can be found in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Strictly speaking, Nietzsche was not a pessimist, since pessimism presupposes assigning negative value to life, which Nietzsche famously didn't do. Despite writing extensively on tragedy, Nietzsche's philosophy was life-affirming. He viewed personal suffering as something that can be transformed into a creative force, and considered such struggles as disease a necessary obstacle on a path to real health. If one can call it a pessimism, then it will be a pessimism of strength. It is when the tragedy of life is acknowledged, but not accepted. Part 2. Human Puppets. Pessimist philosophers in unison tell us to forget about free will and agency. As is the case in video games, where you can only operate within the confinements of what developers designed, in real life as well, our agency is illusory. Since ancient times, philosophers have questioned the existence of free will and whether it can get in conflict with the laws of the universe or God's providence. Certain thinkers were satisfied with some form of compatibilism, which in more recent years was defended by, for example, Daniel Dennett, that yes, some things are determined, but we can still exercise free will as moral agents. For instance, an early medieval philosopher, Boethius, who was unjustly executed during his imprisonment, wrote The Consolation of Philosophy, where he tried to reason himself out of despair and suffering. For him, free will can be realized in having a proper perspective for a misfortune, while the misfortune itself is not something that we have control over. Bad things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people, and God knows it, it is all part of the plan, don't worry about it. At the same time, some thinkers are hardcore determinists. For instance, in his recent book Determined, neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky rejects the existence of free will. Our behavior, thought processes, and desires are dictated by biological and environmental factors that can be traced centuries back, and we don't have any control over these factors that shaped us the way we are. That sounds a bit grim, but the tone of this book is quite optimistic, as Robert Sapolsky believes that our awareness of the lack of free will eventually can be used to better society. When the question about the existence of free will is raised, the first concern is usually the ethical one. How can anyone be held accountable in cases of wrongdoings if free will doesn't exist? What about moral responsibility? According to Sapolsky, the acceptance of determinism can potentially lead to some positive reforms in the justice system. If we stop moralizing crimes, it will help to move from retributive justice to utilitarianism. So here we have determinism, but with a gleam of hope. Another book that makes a very strong determinist argument and is pessimistic is Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation. As was mentioned before, the will to live is a non-anthropocentric force that makes things go around. It is unhuman and goes beyond ethical concerns over how institutions like criminal justice work. It is a negative metaphysical principle. In his essay on the post-punk band Joy Division, Mark Fisher described the will to live as the constant drive of an undead that continuously tries to preserve itself. One of Schopenhauer's followers, Philip Mainlander, in his Philosophy of Redemption, contrasts will to live with the universal principle of will to die, in which every aspect of natural existence is directed towards self-destruction rather than preservance. Mainlander ended his own life on the day of publication of this book. Another work that argues that free will doesn't exist is the pessimist manifesto, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, written by Thomas Ligotti. In this book, the absence of free will is presented through the idea of a puppet. I already mentioned in my video on Barbie as a post-human prototype that puppets frequently occur in Ligotti's work. Puppets aren't just uncanny replicas of humans. They are a manifestation of an ontological horror. To an extent, the figure of a puppet or any uncanny replicas of humans in a fiction story is a proxy for something truly horrifying that we cannot put a finger on. They create the atmosphere to distract us from the real thing. The real thing is that we cannot for sure state that we ourselves are autonomous. The horror that puppets conceal is precisely the horror of determinism. The disposition towards pessimism or belief in the existence or absence of free will is itself dictated by certain biological and environmental factors. For example, it's not a secret that a lot of pessimist thinkers suffered from clinical depression or anhedonia. So it's only natural that they would have a grim outlook on life. A disillusioned pessimist is no less of a human puppet than a person who is oblivious to the horrors of life. Similarly, you did not choose to watch this video. I didn't choose to make this video about this specific topic. Also, is there really an I, this discrete self, to begin with? If there is an illusion of free choice, then why there couldn't be an illusion of a separate self? According to the neurophilosopher Thomas Metzinger, our brain creates a, quote, phenomenal self-model that only simulates personhood. The self is felt, but it cannot be found. So we have to be satisfied with what Metzinger calls, quote, naive realism, a consciousness that represses the truth about ourselves. Part 3. Consciousness. A major point in philosophical pessimism is the problem of consciousness, or rather the tragedy of consciousness. Even if there is no selfhood, we still believe that we are someone. It is impossible to feel determined in day-to-day life. Thus, self-defeating thoughts, awareness of death, and pessimism still have to be repressed and shelved somewhere on the outskirts of our minds. So it comes as no surprise that the strive for ego death, the pursuit of oneness, to finally make pain and suffering go away, is also one of the scenarios of defeating the pessimism. The Buddhist enlightenment, psychedelic experience, and strong romantic affection, sometimes known as limerence, all promise some form of escape from ourselves. But as a matter of fact, these are not cures. They are either temporal or virtually unattainable, like the Enlightenment. Ligotti in The Conspiracy mentions how, despite prolonged fascination with the ego death and the Enlightenment in the world's history, we can count only a few people who actually succeeded in it. And even in these cases, the reports are unreliable, and the Enlightenment was neither pre-planned nor anticipated. More often than not, preceded by some tragic accident or near-death experience. There is no reliable way to unbound the self. So most pessimist philosophers would agree with Rust Coe's phrase,
I think human consciousness was a tragic misstep in evolution.
Arthur Schopenhauer said that consciousness is an accident of life. A Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno considered consciousness as a disease, the result of confrontation between rational knowing that we will die and irrational desire for immortality. A Norwegian philosopher and mountaineer, Peter Zapffe, in his seminal essay The Last Messiah, also regarded consciousness as maladaptation, while pessimism is the inevitable conclusion to which consciousness leads. For Zapffe, human consciousness is a tragedy because it makes us aware of suffering and death. So we create all sorts of activities just to distract ourselves from the existential dread that our consciousness brings. Think about the short story that I begin this video with, where residents of Miraco created a hysterically uplifting festival just to conceal the presence of melancholic clowns. Similarly, we are biologically and culturally programmed to guard ourselves from dark thoughts. Zapffe presents 4 strategies for mitigating the suffering that consciousness brings. First, the isolation from these thoughts. The second is anchoring. This means mitigating the anxiety by finding stability in institutions like religion, morality, natural law, country, family, and anything that gives a feeling of existential security. I think that in modern times, transhumanism can also be added to methods of anchoring to some extent. The transhumanist project is directed towards mitigating suffering and prolonging life. By constantly betting on the future, it lessens anxiety about the present. Recently, there has been a lot of mocking, at least on the internet, of figures like Brian Johnson, who uses extravagant methods to extend his life. For instance, he transfuses the blood of his son and meticulously measures his organs in pursuit of slowing the process of aging. I listened to some interviews with Brian Johnson, and he admits that his actions are motivated by the anxiety about his mortality. Thomas Ligotti mentions that transhumanism is basically the secular rebranding of the Christian rapture, where the best future is promised to the chosen ones who can afford the new technologies. The third strategy is distractions, such as entertainment, career, little projects, finding yourself, such temporal painkillers as falling in love. The fourth and the final one is sublimation. According to Zapffe, this is the rarest strategy. Sublimation is when a person faces the paralyzing horror of existence and reworks the most unnerving and depressing aspects of life into art or any form of creativity. For instance, Romanian philosopher Emil Cioran, another pessimist by the way, wrote, quote, "A book is a postponed suicide." I want to focus more on sublimation as a strategy and specifically on how it works in a case when a pessimist thinker creates horror fiction. The link between philosophy and horror has been explored by various philosophers such as Eugene Thacker, Mark Fisher, and Dylan Trigg. But nowhere is this thread between the two more present than in the work of Thomas Ligotti. In the 2017 article, No, Everything is Not Alright, Supernatural Horror as Pessimistic Argument, Ethan Stoneman and Joseph Packer wrote that weird fiction and supernatural horror function as a sort of Trojan horse. Under the guise of uncanniness and mystery, it introduces philosophical pessimism. Ligotti's or H.P. Lovecraft's supernatural horror and weird fiction, by destabilizing our sense of existential security, make us question the very nature of reality. This is not the case for all media that touches on horror or tragedy. There are a lot of artworks where the conflict is usually settled, and the audience or reader can live with a sense of completeness. Think of the True Detective Season 1. Despite having probably one of the best depictions of a pessimist in media, the first season still ends up on an optimistic note. In the end, Detective Cole describes the universe as a battle between light and dark and says that the light is winning. But it is not always the case. While I was still at the uni, I remember attending a public talk with a Russian director, Andrei Zvягintsev, famous for his excruciatingly tragic movies. There was a question from the audience on why all of Zvyagintsev movies have such tragic endings, to which the director responded that the goal of his work is not to resolve the conflict so that viewers will leave a movie theater with a sense of peaceful resolution and pat themselves on the head for doing nothing, but rather to frustrate viewers to the point that they will be moved by the unease to change something about their own life. I think that in the same vein, horror fiction like Ligotti's dismantles traditional optimistic structures and disorients the audience. It nullifies the foundations of our knowledge. In this light, one might say that it is Ligotti's fiction rather than his non-fiction that successfully defends pessimism. Strictly speaking, Ligotti's The Conspiracy Against Human Race is not a formal academic work. Eugene Thacker, in The Horror of Philosophy, describes the style of Ligotti's conspiracy as the carnivalesque humor of a hangman. It is at times playful, sarcastic, and at times very grim, hence the topic. But this work is not just a stylized retrospective of pessimistic thought. Ligotti uses reasoning to defend the pessimistic worldview. However, since the resistance to pessimism is rooted in the whole body of world philosophy, the argumentative structures Ligotti uses undermine his own goal. Throughout the history of philosophy, there were many attempts to reason with negative evaluation of life, and one might even say that the whole discipline of philosophy is a big attempt to defeat pessimism. Even Ligotti himself admits that, quote, "Pessimism is a set of ideals that none can follow to the letter. It cannot fully realize itself as a philosophy, because the philosophical realization of the insignificance of life paradoxically turns it into value, something to argue for or against, something to engage with as a thought experiment, even if you are a non-pessimist. It is something to make a video about." Philosophical pessimism might also be motivating. As Stoneman and Thacker point out, even pessimist manifestos like Ligotti's Conspiracy can have a cathartic effect on the reader or motivate to heroically face suffering, both of which challenge the influence of pessimism. But Ligotti's fiction disarms the reader, because it doesn't have to abide by any conventional scenarios, use reason, console us, or give any sense of closure. Instead, it invites us to the supernatural world, where a pessimistic experience is sublimated into a masterful story. Like the character from the short story I mentioned at the beginning of this video, we accept the invitation to the world of the unknown. And as we get a closer look, we can see that beneath the layers of style and tasteful descriptions of fictional and seemingly harmless pains and horrors lurks something real. And this is the moment when horror ensues.